The Orphans of Simitra, by Jacques Bonzon. Chapter 1. Porthos was looking after his goats. They were lively goats, as swift in their leaping as hunting hawks, more cunning by far than the little foxes that people the mountains of Pindus. Looking after the goats never brought Porthos anything but trouble. All the same, he liked to go along with them to the hills, for then the whole sky was his, and the sky over Greece is very beautiful. While his charges roamed where they pleased, horns held high and ears lifted by the wind, Porthos would stretch out full length on the sun-scorched turf and look up at the sky, staring at it unwaveringly. On this particular day, Porthos was turning over in his mind a wonderful idea. He was staring the road, the high road that climbed the mountain slopes from Konitsa to ambled through olive groves until it reached the beautiful bay of Arctic, set in the rock the lake. Even though all Greeks, whether grown up only 12, like Porthos, have the germ of poetry within them, they never forget that their land is poor. They have to live. They can go barefoot for most of the year, make do with a bowl of goat's milk and handful of olives when they are hungry, shelter from the cold in a rough cabin, but they must at least possess a roof, goats, and olive trees. Porthos' father did in fact possess these things, but the cabin was tumbled down. There were only 3 goats, and those nearly dry, and a few olive trees so old that they no longer had the strength to bear fruit. Hardly a week went by without his father saying, "The children are growing so fast we won't be able to feed them." "What can we do?" sighed his mother. "I don't know, perhaps leave here and look for work in the marble quarries." And his mother began to weep again, for she could not imagine leaving, just like that, the poverty-stricken countryside that had given them birth. One day the father had a brain wave. "Suppose we take over that old shanty by the roadside, no one uses it for anything. What would we do with it?" "Turn it into a garage." The mother laughed. "A garage? We haven't even got a car, and with our miserable little savings we're not likely a garage for repairing the cars that go by. There's only one mechanic in Simitra, and none at all along the road. My poor Christopher, you know the first thing about cars. You've only driven bullock carts and wheelbarrows. I can learn, and Constantine and Porthos can help me. And the tools you need, where will they come from?" "I'll buy some." "What will you use for money?" "I'll borrow some." And that is why, for 2 years now, tourists traveling along the sun-baked road that winds between Konitsa and Arctic have been able to read these words on a dilapidated hut by the wayside of the Patagos service station. Underneath, the unaccustomed hand of Christopher Patagos had added repairs breakdown service. The word gasoline was unfortunately missing. That was Porthos' wonderful idea, his great dream to have a gasoline pump. That is what he was thinking about that day as he looked after his goats. This idea had been with him a long time, in fact ever since his father took him to the fair at Janina. Janina is not a big town, but since it is set at the junction of 2 main roads, it carries considerable traffic. On the outskirts of the town the modern service station had been built, all white, with gold lettering, a magnificent gasoline pump standing sentinel at each side of the door. Porthos had stood gasping with admiration in front of the person who was working them, a boy not much taller than himself, dressed from head to foot in scarlet overalls, and wearing a cap as loaded with gold as the shop front itself. There he stood gasping with admiration in front of the garage, straight as a cypress, waiting for customers. Every time the car stooped, the little scarlet dome rushed forward, brought up a long tube, unscrewed the cap, solemnly pressed a button and filled the tank. Then, as the car, filled now to the brim, set off in clouds of blue smoke, he bowed politely, one hand to the peak of his gold-braided cap. For 2 whole hours Porthos stood there, as motionless as the gasoline pumps. He would have been there still if his father, bathed in perspiration, crimson with fury, and dragging his newly acquired nanny goat on a rope, had not snatched him from his contemplation. From that day Porthos had only one ambition: to wear red overalls and be in charge of a gasoline pump. Sitting on the slope, he looked along the road. Cars passed and overtook each other. They were of all kinds, from the decrepit and outdated cars of the small shopkeepers of the area to the beautiful chromium-plated model loaded with whizzed by silently and speedily, raising clouds of dust behind them. These were the ones that interested him most. What far distant country had they come from? Where were they going? Before his eyes danced the image of the little red dome at Janina. Oh, When would his father set up a gasoline pump? It must be confessed that very few cars stopped at the shabby garage Patagos, where the only tools were a jack that didn't work properly, and about half a dozen wrenches. The only tourists that pulled up in front of its doors were those who had no choice. Papa Christopher found himself called upon mainly to mend inner tubes. It would cost a great deal to set up a gasoline pump. A big storage tank would have to be excavated underground, and where would they find the money? Propping his head on his hand, and once again letting his goats crop the maize, Porphyros said to himself, if only more tires got punctures, say 4 or 5 a day at 10 drachmas a time, it would make quite a good amount by the end of the month. Papa Christopher would have enough money to set up a pump. He thought, after all, it isn't really impossible. The road has many rough spots in it. The day before yesterday 2 cars had to stop. He was deep in all sorts of calculations when he heard the distant sound of a powerful engine. A heavy truck loaded with gravel was bumping over the uneven surface of the road. Feeling vaguely uneasy and filled with foreboding, he watched it approach. The big truck went by, continued on its way, then turned in toward the lower side of the road and drew up between 2 cedars. He rose to his feet, staring with all his eyes, and saw the tip rising toward the sky, so that the gravel slid down with the rushing sound. The waterfall. Porphyros turned pale. They were going to repair the road, to tar it. No more punctures, no gasoline pump, no boy in red with a gold-braided cap. He rubbed his eyes on his cuff, and ran off.